Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Role of Benchmarking in Influencing Corporate Action on Human Rights. I am Praveena from Q Designs, and I will be a technical facilitator for today. Both the chat function and Q&A will be on, so if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. Please note that the session today is being recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message TF Praveena for help using the chat box. I will now hand over to Namit Agrawal, who is the moderator for this session. Namit, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Praveena. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our session. I think we will have more participants joining us as we start, but I'll start with setting a context of why we are doing this session and what are the objectives of this. As you all know, the COVID-19 crisis has exposed and exacerbated systemic weaknesses, inequalities, and unacceptable practices throughout global value chains. With only 10 years to go to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals or the SDGs, it is also clear that more than ever, urgent change is needed if we are to realize the ambitions of the 2030 SDGs agenda. Benchmarks such as the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark and Know the Chain, both these benchmarks will be presented, and we have speakers who will be talking about these benchmarks, have a role in driving transparency and accountability among companies, especially in the South Asian region. As you know, many of the South Asian countries are developing their respective national action plans on business and human rights. Benchmarks have a potential role in influencing evidence-based policy actions and also influencing how companies respond and react to some of these benchmarks and the evidence coming out of these benchmarks. The Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, for example, assesses human rights disclosures of 230 global companies across 5 sectors, and Know the Chain benchmarks current corporate practices to help companies and investors to understand forced labor risks and address them in their global value chains. Through this session, the aim is to spotlight the role of benchmarks in driving transparency and accountability among companies on their human rights practices. And this becomes significant also in the process of governments trying to develop the national action plan, companies trying to understand what is their role and how can they respect and support human rights in the region. You might have heard in some of the other sessions and the country sessions in the last couple of days of how there are opportunities and challenges in this region. This session is aimed at identifying current gaps in corporate performance, generating knowledge and insights, and amplifying best practice examples for strengthening the private sector's role in respecting human rights in the South Asia region. We have here an excellent panel of speakers, and I'll quickly introduce them. I'll not go and look at a detailed profile, but their profiles are available on the conference website. So please feel free to also connect with them if you want to. We first have Golda Benjamin, who's the Program Director of Business and Human Rights Resource Center. We have Sachin Joshi, who's a well-known sustainability expert working across industry and civil society and various hats that he wears. Camille Lepore, who is the CHRB lead or Corporate Human Rights Benchmark lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. We have Madhu Manjunath, who is a design associate working at the Good Business Lab. And I'm supported by my colleague Iris, who's a public policy manager at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Without further ado, I will get into the presentation, but I also wanted to invite all the participants today to use the Q&A box in the Zoom window to type any questions or comments that you have during the course of this discussion, and we will try and answer those questions during the course of the panel discussion. I would like to now start by inviting Camille to make a quick presentation on the latest corporate human rights benchmark results and a COVID study that was published quite recently. I believe you have a presentation. Great, thanks. The presentation is already up. Kamil, you will have about 10 minutes to make this presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Namit. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, to be part of the second edition of the South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. So first I'll say a few words about the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, or CHRB. And Iris, if we could go to the next slide for this, please. So we benchmark the largest global companies from high-risk sectors on their human rights performance with the CHRB. CHRB is part of the wider World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA, who's hosting this session. The mission of the WBA is to benchmark 2,000 of the largest and most influential global companies on their contribution to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And CHRB sits within the social transformation in this framework. We've published 4 iterations of CHRB to date, from 2017 to 2020. We look at 5 sectors: agricultural products, apparel, extractives, ICT or electronics manufacturing, as well as automotive manufacturing, which was added for the first time in 2020. So 2020 was our 4th cycle, and we published these results in mid-November of last year. We assessed 230 companies from the 5 sectors I mentioned, and these are selected according to their size by market capitalization and their influence. Of these 230 companies in scope in 2020, 6 are headquartered in the South Asia region, in India specifically. And the benchmark also covers supply chains, so many of which extend through the South Asia region, even for companies headquartered elsewhere. In order to assess companies, we use 6 measurement areas, which you can see on the slide. And each company is assessed on about 50 indicators that are distributed in these measurement themes. Importantly, we look exclusively at publicly available information when doing the assessment, and you will have probably recognized from the measurement areas that the methodology is grounded on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as other internationally recognized instruments. We've got nearly 2/3 of companies engaging with us in the process of producing the benchmark. Engagement is optional, given that we look at public information, so there's no survey to fill out for companies. But we found that engagement has been particularly useful, and we know from companies that they found it useful to understand the framework better. But I can come back to this later on. So I'm going to share some of the key findings from our latest benchmark, as Namit said, but also some findings from a study that we published in February, looking at the response of the same 230 companies to the COVID-19 crisis, looking specifically, of course, at human rights and human rights risk management. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Iris. I'll start with the automotive companies, given that this was the new addition, the new sector that we added in 2020. So they were being assessed for the first time by CHRB. So we assessed 30 of the largest automotive manufacturers globally on the full methodology. 2 of these are Indian companies headquartered in India. Unfortunately, for this sector, the results are alarmingly bad. On the slide, you can see the ranking of the 30 companies on the right-hand side. The graph on the left-hand side shows the number of companies in different scoring bands. And the average score for the sector is 12%, which is actually the lowest average score ever for a sector benchmarked by CHRB. Not a single one of these companies scored above 50%, and half of them actually scored below 10%. So these poor results suggest that implementation of the UNGPs is weak across the sector. Ford Motors, Group PSA, and Daimler emerged as leaders for the sector, with scores ranging from 30 to 42%. The 30 companies that you've got on the slide and that were assessed by CHRB were also assessed in the WBA's climate and energy benchmark. And this was the first time we were doing this, but this enabled us to actually analyze how these companies did comparatively on human rights in the CHRB and on climate in the climate and energy benchmark. And here's what we found. So the results show that actually, in spite of human rights and climate change being increasingly understood as issues that are inherently linked, almost no correlation could be found. So we couldn't find a strong correlation between a company's relative performance on either benchmark. So some companies that demonstrated action on climate issues, such as low carbon transition plans, emissions reduction targets, and climate change oversight, disclosed very little, if any, information on how they manage human rights. And similarly, some of the companies that score well, or at least better than their peers, on human rights aren't amongst the top scorers on the climate and energy benchmark. So this lack of correlation for us suggests that many automotive companies still consider climate and human rights issues separately to be addressed independently of each other. And this is concerning given that achieving success in both areas is essential to ensure a just transition. So going forward, we're hoping to see improvements in both areas, but also better understanding of how the two issues are actually linked. Now, looking at the other sectors as well, and if we could go to the next slide for this, please. Looking at the results across all sectors that we assessed, we saw that negative human rights impacts were overwhelmingly felt in developing countries. And you've got the distribution with a map on the slide. And actually, despite the fact that 78%, so nearly 80% of the companies assessed by CHRB are based or headquartered in OECD member countries, 85% of the alleged impacts in scope of the assessment occurred in developing countries. And actually the countries most negatively affected, or where most negative impacts reportedly occurred, were India, China, and Indonesia. We had 104 of the 230 companies assessed with at least one allegation of causing, contributing, or being linked to human rights impacts that were severe enough that they met our severity thresholds, for a total of 225 allegations in scope this year. And you've got a breakdown of the types of allegations on the top right-hand corner of the slide. And whilst we do not assess the allegations on their merit, we look at how companies respond to them. And we see that companies engaged in a dialogue with stakeholders in less than 1/3 of cases, and that they provided remedy that was satisfactory to the victims in only 4% of cases. The benchmark results also show that too many companies are still failing to meet human rights due diligence expectations. And this is really concerning, especially given that human rights due diligence is the process that a company is expected to follow to identify and manage its human rights risks. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, which, as Namit has said, has exacerbated weaknesses and vulnerabilities throughout value chains, this is particularly concerning. So if we could skip the next slide, Iris, and go to the last one. Just want to say a few words about this COVID study before handing back over to Namit. So I mentioned just before that the COVID-19 pandemic has really exacerbated vulnerabilities. So given the impact of the pandemic on working conditions and human rights worldwide, in 2020, we decided to supplement the main regular benchmark results with a COVID-19 study, looking at how companies responded to the crisis. What we found is that whilst some companies took steps to protect their workers, most still need to respond to COVID-19 human rights risks in their supply chain specifically. too many companies failed to demonstrate responsible purchasing decisions to manage negative impacts on workers in their supply chains. And the majority of companies did not demonstrate taking particular account of the human rights risks faced by the most vulnerable workers and communities affected by their operations and their supply chains. So we saw that some broad adoption of some measures and leading practices by some of the companies. And this actually suggests that a good response to the pandemic is possible. So we identified leading practices which are available in our reports. They're on the slide, but I won't go through them in the interest of time. But for us, these examples of leading practice really show that businesses can place human rights at the heart of their response to the COVID crisis, but only if they choose to do so. So we can come back to this later. For now, thank you, and I'll hand back to you, Namit.
Thanks, Camille. I think this was very, very interesting. I'm sure, there's a lot of data in there, and we can probably share the links to the report in the chat for anybody who wants to take a closer look. I also realized I did not introduce myself. So my name is Namit. I work for the World Benchmarking Alliance, looking at public policy engagement in Asia. I would like to now invite Golda. Golda, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center needs no introduction on some of these issues. And your organization develops another important benchmark, Know the Chain. And I would like you to speak about, first introduce what is Know the Chain benchmark, and what are some of the insights, particularly those that are relevant for this region, Asia or South Asia. And you have about 5 minutes for the opening comments.
Thank you, Namit. And good afternoon, everyone, and good evening if you're in other parts of the world. So the Know the Chain is one of the benchmarks that the Business and Human Rights Resource Center has constantly been involved with. It is a resource for companies and investors to really understand and address forced labor risks within their global supply chains. So the Know the Chain benchmark has focused on 3 sectors: information and communications technology, food and beverage, and apparel and footwear. Now, I just want to give briefly a snapshot on why the Resource Center looks at benchmarks as one of the tools for corporate legal accountability. And Know the Chain, we look at the policies of companies. So while the Resource Center also looks at their practice and also seeks accountability and responses from companies when there are allegations of abuse, Know the Chain focuses on their corporate policies. And the thinking behind this benchmark is that corporate policies are the first tool of communication that companies give out to the world in terms of expressing their commitments to human rights. So it is very important, and in many cases, it's the first and only tool that civil society can actually start the conversation with businesses. For example, in telling them, look, you have a policy, for example, on engaging workers, but our experience in our communities is that your people actually do not. So that's the importance of looking at the policies. And so the Know the Chain benchmark has been working with about 170 plus companies around the world across all these 3 sectors. Similar to the discussion with Camille, we focus on publicly traded companies, and we have our methodology limits it to the size in terms of certain market caps for the companies and the extent of their investment in the 3 sectors that we focus on. But for today's session, I'd like to focus on what other companies, not benchmarked by Know the Chain, how they can use Know the Chain methodology and indicators to also look at their own supply chains and value chains, and to really look at their due diligence efforts. So I'd like to go through some of the things that we look at Know the Chain. And we are looking at 7 benchmark themes. So the first, and always this is where the companies do a little bit better, is on the area of commitment and governance to human rights. So we look at, for example, and ask questions whether or not in the first place they have human rights policies. And companies do score a little bit better on that. But going deeper, now we look at really what is the phase of corporate due diligence, and what is the understanding of companies about their obligations? Because we look at these six other themes. One is on traceability and risk assessment. So this is where we ask companies whether or not they disclose, for example, their supply chain or their suppliers, and up to what level. We also look at purchasing practices of companies, and we at the Research Center, especially during COVID, realized that a lot of the purchasing practices of companies are the reasons why the various range of labor abuse and human rights abuse happen, and including forced labor. And this includes, for example, when companies extend payment times or cancel their orders completely because of the pandemic. And then there's the domino effect. It's very prejudicial to the workers. There's the resulting, for example, massive dismissals or wage theft. We also look at recruitment practices of companies, and one of the major themes here is whether or not the brands actually have a commitment to prohibit recruitment fees being paid by their workers. And then the equally important are the themes on worker voice, where we ask the question of whether or not and to what extent companies are really engaging with the workers in their supply and value chains. Then we look at monitoring and remedy. So for purposes of this session, Namit, I really just want also to give a snapshot on how companies have been doing lately. And I'm going to jump off from our latest released benchmark, and that's the food and beverage benchmark. And here are the not so pleasant results. So for commitment and governance, the average, and these are on company policy disclosures, the average score on commitment and governance is around 56%. That's over 100, so a little over passing rate. But there are very, very worrying trends, and these are the bottom scorers. And where are these bottom scorers? It's on the themes of purchasing practices, which have direct and immediate impact to the workers in supply chains. There's the recruitment indicator, where companies still have a lot to do in terms of commitments and improving their practices. And more importantly, worker voice. And this is in relation to remedies. So I think looking at and listening to Camille, similar results actually, that even when companies commit to human rights, the other side, or the flip side, or the other side of the coin is really that they're not hearing their workers enough. They're not talking to them. And so when there is an allegation of abuse, or when abuse is already widespread in the supply chain, the voice of the workers are muffled, or in fact even muted. And that's very important when we talk about effective and accessible remedy. So over the years, for example, in the 2020 food and beverage benchmark, the total average score for all the 7 themes where we are measuring corporate policies, the average score is a sad 28 over 100. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done by companies, and benchmarks are not in any way an honor system or a way of praising companies completely and forgetting what they have not been doing right. It's really just a way to highlight best practices. It's also evidence that it is possible for corporations to improve their processes. So for example, if one company can make an actual commitment and actually act on prohibiting recruitment fees being paid by their workers, then it creates evidence that this particular practice is not something that would be prejudicial to businesses, that it is possible to actually implement this in the supply chains. We're looking at, for example, in COVID, there are companies, brands, that have actually subsidized part of the wage that have not been paid by their suppliers. Again, evidence that this is a thing that is very much possible. So I'm quite excited to proceed to the next parts of the conversations and share some of the ways that companies have used and engaged the benchmark to improve the lives and livelihood of their workers.
Thank you so much, Golda. It's interesting to see similarities between both these benchmarks, and also, quite disappointing results in terms of, while companies are doing good on one aspect, but it cannot be certain for some of the other aspects. I think now it's quite a good segue to bring Sachin into the conversation. And Sachin, I mean, you have engaged and advised so many companies in India on their sustainability policies and reporting issues. Based on your experience, if you could just lay out what is the landscape, at least from an Indian company perspective, and how do you see Indian companies engaging with benchmarks and assessments, not necessarily just these two, but in general? Over to you.
Right. So thank you, Namit, for that kind introduction and also inviting me to share my thoughts. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone. Um, so what Camille and Golda presented really tells us, what the state of affairs are, when you look at the private sector performance on human rights. A lot is desired on the actual performance. So while there might be commitment, which Golda presented, there's a lot to be desired on the performance. That said, the usual suspects, and that's what even these benchmarks, the scope for the benchmarks is in terms of the coverage of the companies. The usual suspects, even in India, are generally open to benchmarks and assessments. Um, I do recognize it's a general statement that I'm making. There are a lot of exceptions, the good ones and not so good one exceptions. But they would be more comfortable with a private engagement, especially if they are getting into a benchmarking or an assessment exercise for the first time. Um, or when there are gaps that they have a sense of or they are adequately aware of, and they know that those gaps are likely to overshadow the baseline status. Uh, because that's where the discomfort and the resistance might appear, that okay, you are going to make the benchmark public, I'm going to be ranked down the pile. That's not very good reputation for me, so it's better that we do this privately, at least give me some head start, allow me the scope to improve, and then next year or later sometime when you can actually put me up there. So that's it's they would be more comfortable with a private engagement to begin with, get that confidence, get the better understanding, and then gradually move up the ladder. The other thing would be that they would like to have a better clarity on the business case. This subject is still, when we present the business case to the management, it is still very qualitative business case, and many times the management doesn't get it. Obviously they are not human right experts, so we have to translate it into a language that they understand. um, the other point emerging from that is that they are willing to learn and improve from that private engagement, um, and then go down the improvement roadmap, and then I think they wouldn't mind too much on you know even going all the way to the public disclosure, or becoming part of a public ranking. um, the a disengaged or a limited engagement process in a benchmarking or in on an assessment exercise is can become a real turnoff for the companies. They feel that there are these outsiders who are evaluating them on the basis of public disclosures. They don't have the full information, and as evaluators, even if we were to justify with a disclaimer that this is based on such and such information, and we invited companies to participate but there was no response, or we can justify the methodology, but all said and done, when it goes out in the public, that can really become turn off and a point of friction also in some cases, which I've also faced myself, when we were doing similar exercises. So I think that is something that we should all bear in mind, if because ultimately the idea is to get together, work in a partnership manner. And finally, I think where they also come from is the unleveled field that they operate in. Many times, especially companies in this region, would feel that while they are willing to perhaps improve, the framework conditions are restraining in some way. And these framework conditions could be the local level of regulatory requirements. The regulatory requirement by itself is very, very low, right? So, or the enforcement is wanting. And the other could also be a socio-economic and cultural context. That also puts a lot of challenges on the conditions in the supply chains with the workers. We in India have lots of challenges with contract labor, which is also a function of our labor laws. If we didn't have the labor laws which promote contractual labor, then we would be able to manage some of those challenges there. So, so these were some of the points I thought I'll just mention to begin with, and then later we can
Sure.
look at the solution side as well. That how do we get to the other side of engagement?
Thanks. Thanks, Sachin. Thanks for bringing out some very, very important challenges from the company perspective. And I totally agree with you on the point around having more engagement for the greater good. And I think one common theme across all the speakers till now has been the focus on policies. And one thing that we also hear from several stakeholders is there is a stark difference between what companies necessarily disclose as policies and what actually happens on ground at a practice.
Namit, it seems we've lost you.
Hello. It seems like there's Namit got disconnected. We are trying to reach out to him. Hopefully he'll be back shortly. Just a slight disruption. Sorry for that. We just got a message from Namit that his Zoom got crashed, but he will be back shortly.
I can take the next step to move to our next panelist to make the intervention. So I hope he will jump back in soon. But for now, this is a good time to maybe move to Madhu and ask her to talk a little bit about the Good Business Labs and what they do there and what insights they've gathered from their recent work with interviews with women workers. Madhu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Iris, also for this opportunity. Thank you so much. So Good Business Lab is a research organization whose motto is worker well-being is good business. And we try to prove this through rigorous research using design thinking and randomized control trials amongst many other methods. And we try to make a business case out of this so that more companies are convinced to invest more in their worker well-being programs. So for this particular project, we're collaborating with WBA, whose the project's purpose is to ascertain the needs of workers in a garment factory and also their awareness and satisfaction levels of the facilities that's already being provided by their employers. And our chosen method for this approach was qualitative interviews. For this, we conducted about 30 telephonic interviews, which lasted anywhere from an hour to sometimes 2 hours. And the main themes for this study, I'm so sorry for the disturbance. The main themes for this study were grievance redressal, health, and career growth. Due to the time constraint, I will be limiting to just grievance redressal today. And before moving to the actual insights from the worker interviews, I'd like to give you some context to what a factory floor looks like. A typical production floor is generally a tense environment. You know, everyone's chasing to meet their targets, especially the second half of the day when they have to make up for the lags from the earlier part of the day. And they also have a supervisor who's around them to bring them up to speed and help if needed. The main composition of the workers on the factory floor is mainly women. I would say about 90% at the operator level, and the supervisory roles are towards. I'm sorry. Could I be excused for just a second so that I can leave my dog out?
Sure. So while we wait for Madhu to come back, I'll just try and make an announcement again. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box to type your questions or comments here. And I did get a message from Surya. I think he's not able to type in his question. So I don't know if you can just share your question once we break for Q&A. I think Madhu is back, so we'll go back to Madhu and take questions later.
Sorry about that, Namit.
That's okay.
So yeah, moving towards the key insights from our interviews. So one needs to know that, you know, workers are generally very afraid to register a complaint if they have to go do this directly by talking to their HR or their supervisor. This is generally because of the fear of negative repercussions they might have to face, especially if the complaint is against their own supervisor, because which is a common complaint because they do pass lewd remarks on the factory floor if somebody is lagging behind. To quote a worker, you know, supervisors even tend to threaten saying, I'll kick you out of my line or I'll kick you out of this company just because they're lagging behind by a few number of pieces. And when asked if the supervisors treated other males the same way, the answer was unanimously no. And also most women think that gender plays no role in performing the task of a supervisor, but there's a good number of women who also think that most supervisors are men because women don't have the same kind of hold as a male supervisor would. That is, women don't generally tend to yell at others for being late or for being slow at their work. They just don't do that, which is one of the reasons that they think they're not suited for this role. Some of the other insights were that, like, because of this reason, they prefer to send their grievances anonymously through suggestion or complaint boxes that's generally put in a factory floor. There's also this other tool called Inache, which is actually a GBL tool that we helped design and develop from scratch. And we continue to monitor its effectiveness through randomized control trials, which is live in 34 factories as of now, and will be expanding to different locations and industries soon in a phased manner. What Inache does is that it's a digital tool which registers grievances anonymously, and the key aspect of this is that because everything is digitized, all the complaints are resolved at a faster rate because everybody is held accountable in that chain of workers. And in the time period of December 2019 to November 2020, we did a comparative study of the effectiveness of INACHE compared to the conventional methods, where we found that using the conventional methods, the same number of factories received about 480 cases, that is through helpline and suggestion boxes, whereas through INACHE treatment, the same number of units received about 2,082 cases. So yeah, that goes to show that the workers do have some concerns, but they're just afraid to raise that because of the negative repercussions from their factory management.
Thanks, Madhu, and also apologize everyone. There was a power cut, and that's why I think I disappeared for a few minutes. Thanks for raising the issues around grievances and remedy, and I love this innovative tool that you're talking about, INACHE. And I mean, if you have more information, I'm sure everybody will be interested in knowing more about this tool and how does it work, and what are the learnings of implementing this. Please do share now or later as you may want to. And also, I love the comment in the chat that even your dog had a perspective, and I think that was a good one. And that's the challenge or fun of working from home. So no issues with that. I think we've heard the initial perspective of all the panelists, and now I would like to go ahead with some follow-up questions. And starting with you, Camille, I think one of the points that we have been hearing is engagement, that the data and the evidence coming out of the benchmark is just one part. So if you can just share some lessons from your CHRB experience, how do companies, investors, and other stakeholders use the CHRB data? And it will be great if we can make it more relevant for this region in Asia, South Asia.
Great, thank you, Namit. So yes, definitely interesting to hear about the company engagement emphasis from Sachin's presentation. So in our experience, companies use the methodology for guidance on what is considered good practice and what disclosures are expected. But also beyond the use of the methodology, they use the actual results. So we ask companies to be transparent, so it's only fair that we're ourselves transparent. So we publish the data at a very granular level, and that's also so that companies inside and outside of the scope of the benchmark can identify leading practices from peers. And so that applies to, as I said, companies inside and outside of the benchmark, to all regions. If companies want to focus on the practices of their peers in their region, so say Indian companies want to focus on Indian companies, they can use the data set to filter to those companies headquartered or operating around them who are likely to face the same challenges. So in that sense, benchmarks aren't just an accountability tool, they're also very much a learning tool for learning and improvement. That's for companies. In terms of investors, they use the results to inform their research and their own due diligence, as well as in their engagement activities. So some examples include individual engagement with companies, so these ongoing dialogues that they've got with investee companies, but also collective engagement efforts. So for example, a coalition of over 200 institutional investors formed around a statement targeting the companies that score 0 on human rights due diligence, so don't score any points on human rights due diligence in CHRB. And then other investor actions include voting against companies that score poorly, as well as using shareholder resolutions. When it comes to governments and actually multinational organizations, policymakers in general, they can use the benchmark results to inform their decisions and use the tools at their disposal and the data to inform legislation efforts, for example. So in the case of human rights due diligence, the low scores on human rights due diligence in CHRB have actually been used as evidence that actually more needs to be done very urgently on human rights due diligence, and leading into efforts, especially at the EU level currently, around mandatory human rights due diligence. So there are others. I won't have time to go into all of them. CSOs use also the benchmark results for advocacy purposes, academia for research. But those kind of dynamics apply to the South Asia region just like they apply elsewhere. So I'd say that it's thinking about all those different levers that can be pulled to increase accountability, but also capacity building and learning, using the data as a start. But definitely the benchmarks are the start and not the end in themselves.
Thanks, Camille, and really, good insights in terms of how some of the investor groups are engaging. And hopefully, through the conversation, we can also get some insights on how other stakeholder groups can or are engaging. And with this, I'll bring Golda in the conversation. And Golda, if you can share, what has been your experience in engaging companies in South Asia? The Research Center has the website response mechanisms, and you do a lot of engagement with companies. Do you see an increase in engagement in recent years, given that BHR is becoming more popular in this region? And is there more interest in appetite and transparency, evidence-based engagement in the region?
Yes, Namit, definitely there has been an increase in responses from Asian companies. I joined the Research Center in 2017, and it was always quite difficult when the allegations of abuse concern Asian companies. But through the years, we've been getting more and more responses from Asian companies. And I attribute it to two major reasons. First is that this is really a testament to CSO and stakeholder engagement also in the region. The interest is not just in business and government, but more importantly, civil society is working on BHR issues very deeply now in the region. And so this engagement and pressure dynamics is also pushing companies to be more responsive to transparency and disclosure efforts. And number two really is that we know the data that Asian companies and intra-Asia and intra-ASEAN investments are poised to really overtake investments in the region coming from, for example, the US and the EU. So the scope of Asian companies are now quite global, and so the attention is also quite global. But in terms of trends in the responses, Asian companies tend to respond very broadly to allegations of abuse. They tend to respond more positively and in more specific ways if the allegation has something to do with violations or allegations of violations of laws or normative regulations. So, for example, whether or not they conducted environmental impact assessments, we get a bit of response to that. But similar to the rest of the world, a lot of the Asian companies, South Asian companies, are also not very responsive when the allegations have something to do with attacks and threats against human rights defenders. Still a very, very sensitive issue among business, and even quite a challenging issue also for civil society organizations. But we take it as an opportunity that there is interest and also a sense of responsibility growing on the part of businesses to respond to accurate allegations and calls for transparency and more disclosure. So for me, that's always a step forward. And we still have a lot of work to do in the coming years.
Thanks, Golda. Yes, indeed, a long way to get more engagement and actual action on ground in the region. And I would like to bring Madhu in the conversation. And Madhu, if you can highlight, when working in supply chain with workers, what gaps do you see between company policies, disclosures, and actual practices in supply chain? Because that's often the contention that while the disclosures and policies say one thing, that does not necessarily translate into action in the supply chain. What has been your observation?
Thanks, Namit. This is a very important question, but unfortunately, I think it's slightly difficult for us to comment on this based on only a few worker interviews. especially because the purpose of our interviews was mainly to understand workers' needs. So we were not able to conduct a comprehensive study on whether or not what the companies are disclosing is available for the workers. But what we did find through our interviews, something that we find very interesting, is two aspects to this. One is awareness, which is what I mean by this is that there are some fundamental conventions and standards that every company has to comply legally, which is pretty much done by these companies that we did interview. But the thing is, the main concern about this was that the workers were not really aware of all the rights they had. For example, one of the ILO's 8 fundamental conventions is the right to organize and collectively bargain. We did have a specific persona where we wanted to interview a few workers who fit into this, who were part of such uh, unions and very vocal about their issues, but we just could not find anybody. And out of the 30 people that we did interview, there was nobody who was part of any such organization. So neither did they know if this was allowed in their company or restricted by their employer. So yeah, there was no participation from them at all. And the second thing that we found very interesting is the scale of the company. Because in our interviews, we interviewed the workers from three companies. One of them is a large manufacturing exporter in India, while the other two are generally like smaller companies with about 20 to 30 workers in their factories. Um, the scale is very important because while they do provide all of these facilities that is required of them, they do it in a different way because a bigger company can afford facilities such as a dispensary or a crash at the workplace, but smaller companies have to resort to other options to meet these needs. For example, a smaller company that we did speak to informed us that they allow their pregnant women or women with young kids who, when they cannot provide them with crash facilities, these women are given the opportunity to work from home, take their material home, work from there, and bring it back once a week and collect their next consignment. uh, that is pretty doable. And the second contrast that we saw was that a smaller company might lack a formal grievance redressal system, something like Inache, but they do make up for it by having more women in senior roles, so that their other workers who are working at the operational level are more comfortable in raising their concerns to their senior women who are in the managerial positions. And also, when you talk about career growth in a bigger company, there is a dedicated team which is only training their new fresh workers, and they dedicate a full 3-month period for them to learn the whole of it. And also they have the opportunity to learn new skills as and when their next consignment needs for them to learn a new style or a new kind of stitching. But a smaller company might not be able to afford to give 3 months and dedicate it for just training. But what they do is they allow their workers to observe other fellow workers and learn from them. And when somebody is on leave, they substitute each other and they help each other. This way they don't specialize in one thing, but they do get their knowledge about a variety of aspects of this business.
Thanks, Madhu, for also bringing in the nuance between large and small companies and how sometimes the practices might also differ there. And I totally understand it. It's difficult based on just anecdotal evidence to talk about, what is the general scene in terms of practice level gaps. So thanks for that. And Sachin, I wanted to bring you in the conversation now. And you spoke about reluctance and resistance, but also stressed on the importance of engagement, for companies, for benchmarks, and to increase transparency. If I can ask you in terms of what are the drivers for sustainability reporting and business and human rights for Indian companies, and what role can benchmarks play, not just CHRB and Know the Chain, but in general, Indian international benchmarks? What role can they play to help support more Indian companies disclose better and also engage more in these processes?
Thanks, Namit. So in terms of drivers, I would classify them into two. Um, One would be a cluster of uh, direct issues that relate to business. So, for instance, access to finance. So one would assume that there is a correlation between better human rights performance and improvement in access to finance, especially the club of investors which are looking at a lot of these ESG considerations. So that could be one. Um, the other definitely is reputational risk. Um, and or otherwise, I mean, drop the word risk in general, reputation. Um, and then, the third one in that cluster would be risk management and business continuity. Because a lot of the issues, even say the ones that Golda and Madhu were just illustrating, um, are actually risk management issues. And they many times in occurrence of those risks, the impact on business continuity could be realized by the management. So that would be one cluster. The other cluster, which drives companies towards reporting and human rights improvements, is to do with stakeholders. So one there would be, I would group all those stakeholders into one are core business stakeholders, in the sense that they are business partners. Yeah, they are regulators, both domestic and international. Some of even now the trade agreements, bilateral or multilateral trade agreements, have begun to include human right considerations. Though there also there's a yawning gap between intent and performance. So that's another point. And then you have investors, which you also just mentioned as well, and Camille also mentioned how investors are using information. So that is very important. I think, and just if I may go back to your question for Madhu on supply chain workers, I think the supply chain really lacks scrutiny. That is something which is very important. Just to give you an example, we since we are in South Asia, and more or less the conditions in South Asia are comparable. um, when we see some roadside construction, even by the government agencies, so say for instance there's a repairing or carpeting of a road which is taking place, and you see it's a few days of work, and then it's not difficult to find that the workers are actually just staying by the road side. That's where they cook, that's where they bathe. And that's really inhuman condition to put your workers in. Agreed that they are contractual, but that's exactly the issues that we are concerned about, that how do you honor the dignity of a human being, no matter which part of the hierarchy and the value chain they are in. So that's where the scrutiny, and a lot of these public works are actually funded by the government, right? The contractor is actually the government. So if the government cannot uphold those basic rights for these workers, then what do we expect many other people in the system to do? So that was one. Now the benefits of benchmarks. At the enterprise level, I think it does few things. One is it helps identify the gaps. Obviously, it's really useful for the management. It also identifies the areas of improvement, and how some of those improvements could be implemented. It also helps a lot in learning from the other peer group companies, especially in the sector, because a lot of the issues are common across the sectors. So learning from those good practices, what are those sector specific issues and how to solve them? And then you have the prioritization of issues and action. So a benchmark, and even the due diligence process can actually throw up a lot of issues, but then you can't act on all of those at the same time. So it can really help in prioritizing as well. And finally, this certainly helps in improving the disclosures. And the common theme, as you also identified on this panel, has been that there's a lot of intent, there's a lot of commitment, but not enough evidence to show that that is followed through. And so once the companies start to make progress in quantifiable indicators, then the quality of their disclosures also can improve. Otherwise, it's all verbose commitments. At the macro level, if we consider all of this, then it does help in overall increasing the lowest common denominator that a regulation sets. I mean, regulation usually sets the lowest benchmark, right? And then the idea is to keep improving from there. So that's what can happen. So once, through voluntary initiatives of the companies and stakeholders on this panel, once we manage to bring that critical mass, the standards of the sectors go up, then you can always go to the regulators and say that now we need, so these businesses would go to the regulators and say, listen, I'm at a disadvantage. I don't have a level playing field because I'm doing better, which is also means extra cost and lack of competitive advantage for me. In order to, address that, you need to really upgrade the standards of the sector through regulation. So it's an interesting closed loop. And I think that's a very significant. It of course happens over a longer gestation period, but that's how we've seen it in the past as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sachin. Yeah, I think it's indeed a process, and prioritization is key. And thanks for also bringing in the more systemic nature and looking at this entire loop rather than bits and pieces and trying to address it. We have now time for a few questions. And I know Iris will read out a few questions that have come up, but I also wanted to check because Surya mentioned that he's not able to put his question on chat. I don't know if Surya, you're still with us, and if you can just unmute yourself and just quickly ask your question.
Thanks, Namit. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Surya.
Thank you. Thank you once again to all the panelists. I think very insightful discussion. My questions are primarily about CHRB, so perhaps Camilla may answer those questions. I have three quick questions. One is, how do you assess the access to remedy? I think if I remember correctly, you mentioned only the 4% companies in your benchmark, they provided remedies which are considered sufficient or suitable by the affected communities. How do you assess this? That's my first question. Second is about informal economy, because in South Asia in particular, in the global South, informal economy is big. So how this benchmark is considering to make changes in informal economy. My third question, which perhaps is more challenging question, is that one criticism of CHRB is that you are looking at what companies are saying they are doing, their commitments, what they're disclosing, but you're not looking at actual practices of companies. You're not looking at the rights holders who are affected by companies, or you're giving not proportional, let us say, consideration to those impacts. So in that particular context, are you creating a very hollow race to the bottom, race to the top? Thank you.
Thanks, Surya, for those questions. And while Kamil, you prepare your response, maybe we can take a few more questions, and then I can invite all the panelists to respond to all the questions or some specific questions. Iris, can I request you to ask a question, please?
Definitely. Thank you, Namit. Yeah, so we've received a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Please keep going with them as we answer those questions. A couple to add to the questions just asked already is there was also one question more about indeed also the CHRB, about what HRDD process is accepted when in the benchmark. So that adds nicely to the questions already asked. There's also a comment on the need for greater legal clarity and legal certainty for different different sizes of companies. So if that is something you want to reflect on as well, that would be very interesting. And I think in relation to that, it could also be very interesting looking at the questions to reflect a little bit on what you think that government should be could be doing with benchmark data in the area of regulating specific sectors. I know that both Camille and Sachin already touched on this briefly, but there may be others also that have insights. I think we can leave it at that, and maybe I think that's enough for now. Maybe we can come back later.
Thank you, Iris, and thank you everyone for those questions. And maybe we can start with you, Camille, and then I can ask other panelists to also respond. I guess some of the questions are also applicable, and I'm sure all the panelists will also have perspectives. So please feel free to jump in and respond to some of these questions.
Thanks very much, Namit. And thank you, Surya and others for the great questions. So I'll take them in order. So I'll start with serious questions. So how do we assess access to remedy? So following the UNGP's structure, so we look at different things. We look at commitments. So do companies have a commitment to providing remedy when they need to? We also look at processes. Do they have grievance mechanisms in place to actually turn that commitment into reality? So do they have grievance mechanisms available for workers in their own operations and in their supply chains, but also external stakeholders that may be impacted by their operations or their suppliers or business partners' operations? And then we look at some criteria that would guarantee the effectiveness of those grievance mechanisms. So are they trusted? So do users actually use them? Are they involved in the design of them? Does the company disclose practical data about the use of those grievance mechanisms? How many cases? On what topics? How long it takes for them to be resolved? So really the more kind of management system to turn the commitments into practice. And then when it comes to actual provision of effective remedy, we look at, we ask companies to disclose examples of where they've provided remedy and learnings that come from this, but also where we look at specific allegations of negative impacts. There we look at whether the company engaged with the affected stakeholders or allegedly affected stakeholders, and whether they provided remedy that was considered satisfactory to the victims. And that's where this 4% figure comes in, because in only 4% of the cases that we looked at did companies demonstrate providing remedy that was satisfactory to the victims. The informal economy question, this is definitely a challenge because by definition, there's a lack of information. So I think driving for more transparency and therefore increased accountability is one way of pushing for this. But I think this is also where, firstly, other stakeholders can play a role, so governments, but also where we're always open to receiving suggestions for improving the methodology. So if there are kind of concrete ideas from anyone on this session or outside for how we could integrate that into our framework. The methodology is updated not every single year, but we're in the methodology review right now, and every few years it's updated. So we're very much open to suggestions for incorporating such topics. If there are some ideas of how, as a benchmark, we could actually assess those questions. And then thirdly, on the question of the kind of distinction between what companies are disclosing and what actually happens in practice and actual impacts on the ground. That's a question, that's a big question, and the question that we ask ourselves. And in the context of this methodology review I mentioned, this is one of the main aims of the review, is to try and put more emphasis on performance. So this is not to say that we would move away from disclosures on commitments and practices and processes, because this is ultimately, and also grounded in the GPs, what gets us to actual impacts. But yeah, how we can increase the scope of performance indicators. I think it's always going to be a challenge, because benchmarks are a proxy for good performance. We don't do on the ground kind of field investigations, but we do already have some elements of more performance related indicators. So where we look at those allegations, for example, or where we ask companies to disclose very specific information about the proportion of their workforce that's actually covered by collective bargaining agreements. So those metrics where we get closer to actual impacts, or as close as possible. And similarly there, if people have suggestions of some very concrete impact-oriented criteria, we want to hear from you, because they're always hard to put in place. Namit, I'm conscious I don't want to kind of hold up the Q&A time. Should I do the human rights due diligence question quickly?
Yes, quickly, and then I can go to maybe Golda.
Great, so I'll do that quickly. So essentially how we assess human rights due diligence is very much aligned with and based on the UNGPs again. So we look at the kind of the 4 or 5 steps highlighted in the GPs. So companies, how do companies identify their human rights risks? So each company being unique based on their operations, where they operate, the types of materials they source, also the context. Are we in a global pandemic? So for that process to be quite as comprehensive and regularly updated as possible. Then once those risks are identified, does the company assess which ones are most salient? So the highest risk to stakeholders as opposed to risk to the company. Then what does the company put in place to manage those risks, to mitigate them, prevent them from turning into actual impacts? Then how does the company track the effectiveness of the actions taken? And finally, how does it communicate about the whole process to all stakeholders, but specifically to those potentially affected stakeholders?
Thanks, Camille. I think those are tough questions, and it's always a process. Thanks for answering those. Golda, if I can bring you in, some of these questions might also be relevant for the engagement at the resource center, but also know the change, looking at the supply chains, informality. So what are your thoughts on some of these questions that were asked?
Thanks, Namit, and thanks, Professor Surya, for always presenting us with very difficult questions. But I agree with Camille, and this touches into some of the points that I'd like to also raise as part of the last few minutes that we have, is that the role and the challenge to CSOs now is the ability to use these benchmark data first to ensure that our methodology is thorough and comprehensive so that we can continue with evidence-based engagements with companies, but more importantly, recognition of this moment in our history. COVID has actually brought a lot of movements together, labor, business and human rights movements, the environment movements. And our challenge now and our opportunity is to use benchmark disclosures to actually seek accountability from the companies. So, for example, at the Resource Center, one of the 2 of the reports that we recently released are on union busting and also wage theft. And many of the companies that we highlighted in terms of allegations of abuse in their factories are also companies that are benchmarked in Know the Chain. So this effort, this simultaneous effort, complementary effort to look at disclosures and then verify these disclosures in relation to their practices in communities around the world. So we're taking on that challenge and that approach to make sure that the data, the incredible data that we have collected, we have contributed to for many years in terms of corporate disclosure, is actually translated into reforms and transformations to workers and communities around the world. So in terms of putting a face to human rights due diligence, this is our contribution on top of other things. Civil society needs to work with communities and workers around the world to put a face to what HRDD really means to their lives. So asking the right questions, going beyond mere supply chain or supplier transparency, really getting into whether or not these remedies are effective and are also responsive to the actual allegations raised by workers and communities around the world. So it's both a challenge and an opportunity also, Nan.
Thank you, Golda. I will now ask maybe Sachin, your thoughts from a perspective of industry and someone who's been working with a lot of companies. How do we address these challenges? Informal economy remedy is a big challenge. Golda mentioned that benchmarks play a part, but there are others who also have to play their own part. So how do you can you put that in perspective from the industry side and share your views?
Sure. Thank you, Namit. So it's it would be an understatement to say that there's lots and lots of effort required. But I think the important point also would be that we start with the engagement on a positive note. Um, maybe using this, I can also take the opportunity to respond to another question by Vanita. That in my experience, even raising this issue about human rights can scare people. People suddenly go in a defensive mode. They're really wondering, what's going to come out, and things like that. It's as if we are accusing them of violating something, which is not entirely incorrect, but we need to start on a more comforting and a positive note in the engagement. So that is one. The other thing is, one of the CEOs of a multinational company with operations in India had told me, when we were discussing our work, this was way back when I was in CII, and they his advice was that begin with taking specific issues which are human rights issues, and use that as an engagement starting point, rather than just parachute yourself into the company and say, oh, here I am to talk about human rights. So just looking at some of those specific issues which from your own analysis and research and understanding of the sectors, that these are some of the material issues within human rights itself. And that is something that management will be positive to sort of address, because that's also part of the management's agenda. So I think doing some of those could really help begin the engagement on a more collaborative and positive note. The other would also be awareness. I think there's still lots and lots of gaps in understanding within companies, but also and that cuts across hierarchy, even with people who have full-time responsibility for the subject. Even they are still educating themselves on a lot of these issues. But then uh, even the advocates like us, we also need to keep a tab on what all is happening, the progress that is being made, and how do we translate this when we go to the companies. The third point is internal checks and balances. It's once you have the policy in place and then you're putting in those processes, having those internal checks and balances. And I think there also have a slightly more accommodative and encouraging. This is for the managements to do. We are outsiders, right? We can't enforce that much beyond a point. That yes, they have to be combination of carrot and stick approach in those internal checks and balances to see that violations are not excused, but how do you also ensure or encourage and incentivize prevention of a lot of these occurrences? What management has to always keep in mind is that some occurrences, even though they might be isolated, in some cases they might flag into a huge business continuity challenge. And
Right.
we've seen those, right? Lots of such examples already exist around the world, including in this region. So I think those are some of the points that I would mention. But again, awareness, awareness, awareness. That is something that is very important. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Sachin. And Madhu, there was a question for you, and I think on the size and also looking at compliance and affordability. Should it be one size fit all or something that's more tailored? But also, if you have thoughts on the other questions around informal economy and the remedy part, please feel free to also share that in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with the folks that commented, shared this comment about how the one size fits all is not applicable when it comes to different sizes of companies, because one, like I said, affordability is an issue, and another comment did highlight that it's not just about affordability for bigger companies, it's also the legal compliance, because as you grow bigger you have heavier legal compliances to comply with. But my solution would be that we do it like we did this time along with WBA, to come up with a solution together with the workers. This time we did identify the needs of the workers by talking to them, and maybe next step would be to co-create the solution with the workers for whom the benchmark will be aimed at. Because a lot of times what happens is that these benchmarks are mainly for the brands, which then force these benchmarks on the suppliers without being empathetic, and this just causes undue stress on the suppliers, and the final bearers of the stress will be the workers. They might or might not get the services that they really require, but are just burdened with more and more trainings or awareness programs about something that's not needed for them. And also, these awareness programs or any well-being programs, it needs to be tailor-made for that particular population in the particular geographic location that they're at. It has to differ based on where they're at, what kind of companies they're working at. So yeah, again, coming back to that, one size does not fit all.
Sure. Thanks, Madhu. And I think, I mean, that's also an important suggestion, feedback for both the benchmarks as well. So thanks for that. And Madhu, if I can also ask you, I mean, final closing remark, we are almost at the end of our session. By the next South Asia Forum, uh, just doing some visioning and dreaming, what are some of the key changes you would want to see in this region with respect to company performance on benchmark, being more inclusive of supply chains, so that at the end of the day, the benchmark data is being used by more stakeholders, is more meaningful. So, what is that specific change that you would like to see in 1 year?
Hey, I'm sorry, I got cut off for a second. Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, so my question is for the next South Asia Forum in 1 year, what would be your wish, so to say, in terms of change that you want to see in this region with respect to how companies perform on benchmarks, how benchmarks are more inclusive, and how the benchmark data can be more useful for different stakeholders?
Mhm. So in terms of the benchmarks, I think it could be innovative because, like I said, conventional social audits does not, they have certain limitations. They might not be able to capture the kind of services or facilities that is being provided by companies of different sizes. So I think it's very important to capture that, because they're doing what they can, and they're doing best what they can do best at that, what they have. And also just include more people that you're going to create the benchmarks for. My final answer would be to co-create the solution so that the workers know this is what we're getting, and let us tell them that we want this before they just throw something at them.
Great. So more co-creation. Thanks, Madhu. If I can bring Camille in, the same question. What's your wish for the next South Asia Forum? What do you want to see changing?
So, I mean, we mentioned engagement a few times. So it would be great if by the next South Asia Forum, we'd had more engagement coming from some companies in the region. So we're here to engage. We're really keen to engage with them. So perhaps even, I don't know, a session with one of those companies. I think also reflecting on what Sachin said at one point, that what matters is getting together and working in partnership. Absolutely. I think this also comes from some of the other speakers' comments. Collaborative initiatives are essential, given that so many of these human rights issues are systemic, and especially in a specific region, it's likely that the same issues will be common to many companies. So sector collaboration, but also so companies collaborating with one another, but also with other stakeholders, with CSOs, trade unions, experts, as partners for change who can actually support capacity building, and be a link, play this kind of link role with workers and other potentially affected stakeholders.
Thank you, Camille. Sachin, your wish for the next year?
Thanks, Namit. Very simple, no outlandish aspirations that I have. I'll agree with Camille on engagement. I think, improve the engagement from both sides. Our engagement with the companies and more companies to engage. The other is to certainly improve the quality of disclosures, move beyond, I have that policy, I have, 5 different principles and, things like that. Just move beyond that, get into more handy quantitative disclosures as well. The numbers speak a lot. And finally, if I may inject the national action plan, have a useful action plan in place. And what I mean by that is that, which also has very clear goals and articulated, plan. It shouldn't look like a laundry list of, policies in the government and the commitments that the government has made. And this is true for the entire region. It's not just specific to India. It should stay true to the title of the document. It's a national action plan. So hence you need a plan and the destination. So those have to be clearly
great
in the document.
Thanks, Sachin. Golda?
Thanks, Namit. I agree with my hope for greater company engagement by the time we have the next forum. And I also hope that government will respond and support all these efforts. Because, for example, if the benchmark is showing very poor performance on company commitment to freedom of association, then there's a responsibility also on the part of government to provide frameworks that are enablers for freedom of association. So my hope is that the next time we meet, that we're a step closer really to stopping the narrative that we need to present a business case for human rights, because human rights is not an economic decision. It is a decision for humanity. And most of the time, it's even a decision on the survival of workers and communities around the world. So we should stop with looking at human rights as merely something that we need to present a business case for. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Golda. And I would like to thank all the panelists and all the participants for a very, very engaging and insightful discussion. I wouldn't be summarizing this. We are almost out of time, but I think the key points that emerged are definitely collaboration, multi-stakeholder engagement, and looking at more inclusive and meaningful benchmark data, but also the national action plans. Leveling the playing field is important, both at the regulation level, but also otherwise. And I think it's also good to hear some of these examples, but hopefully going forward, until the time we reach the next South Asia Forum, there will be many more examples, and hopefully we will stop talking about awareness, because we've been talking about awareness for many, many years. I feel that now it is time to actually create that awareness so that we can start moving towards more action. So thank you once again, all of you. Thanks to Prabina and Q Design team and Iris for helping me out. It was a great session, and we will be sharing more details hopefully shortly. Thank you, everyone.